The biting wind howled its ancient lament across the vast, indifferent plains, a cruel symphony mirroring the silence that had swallowed her world. A cowgirl, once as fiercely independent as the mustang that roamed these wild lands, lay half buried in the snow, her body a testament to betrayal and the unforgiving embrace of winter. Her leg, a constant throb of defiance, served as a stark reminder of the limitations others had imposed upon her, limitations they had exploited. Her breath plumed in ragged gasps, each one a desperate plea against the encroaching chill, against the creeping numbness that threatened to claim her very soul. This wasn't a question of survival. It was a desperate battle for a shred of dignity in the face of absolute abandonment, a battle against the crushing weight of a world that had decided she was less, that she was expendable. The sun, a pale, anemic orb in the bruised sky, offered no warmth, only a mocking glint off the icy crust that sealed her to the earth. She was a solitary figure, a broken sculpture of resilience, etched against the stark white canvas of a landscape that promised only an icy grave. The whispers of the past, of faces twisted by prejudice and fear, echoed in her mind, a cruel counterpoint to the wind's dirge. They had left her, a woman whose spirit was forged in the fire of the untamed West, to crumble beneath the weight of their judgment, to freeze in the desolate expanse they deemed her rightful end. Her eyes, rimmed with frost, scoured the horizon, not for salvation, but for a sign, any sign, that the universe hadn't utterly forgotten her. This wasn't merely a story of a woman left to die. It was a brutal testament to the raw, unvarnished truth of human cruelty, and the tenacious, flickering flame of hope that can still ignite in the darkest of hours. It was the moment where the world turned its back, and only the raw, primal instinct to survive remained. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The memory was a barbed wire fence in her mind, tearing at her composure every time she tried to push it away. It had been less than a week ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed in the glacial crawl of her suffering. The gathering had been small, hushed, held in the meager warmth of a shoddy shack nestled among the shivering pines. The faces were a blur of familiar and different features. Men who had ridden beside her, shared campfires, and spoken of loyalty as if it were carved in stone. But loyalty, like so much else in this harsh world, proved as fleeting as desert rain. Her foreman, a burly man named Silas with eyes like chips of flint, had spoken first, his voice devoid of warmth, a cold rasp against the nervous shuffle of feet. "Martha," he'd begun, the name a stone in his mouth, "you ain't fit for the trail no more. This leg of yours, it's a liability." Her heart, though already calloused by years of hardship, had fractured. She had worked harder than any man, overcome every obstacle, even after the fall that had twisted her knee and left her with a perpetual limp, a constant ache. She had proved her worth 1,000 times over, but in their eyes, the visible scar, the altered gait, had diminished her to something less than human, something disposable. The others nodded, their expressions a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. They were the societal figures, the normal ones, clinging to their perceived strength by casting out anyone who deviated from their narrow definition of capability. Their silence was a condemnation, a collective shunning more chilling than any Arctic blast. She remembered the fire in her gut, the sharp retort on her tongue, but her words had caught in her throat, choked by the sheer enormity of their betrayal. They had left her with a measly sack of rations, a broken promise of a horse that never came, and the crushing weight of their contempt. The world, already a harsh place, had suddenly narrowed, shrinking to the suffocating confines of her own despair. The images flickered behind her frostbitten eyelids, a cruel cinema of rejection. Silas's unyielding stare, the shuffling boots, the sudden, terrifying solitude as their wagon rumbled away, leaving her to the mercy of the burgeoning storm. This was the moment she understood the depth of human cowardice, the ease with which one could be discarded when inconvenient. The raw wound of that abandonment festered, keeping her alive with its agonizing sting, a grim reminder of why she could trust no one, not even the faint hope of a distant shadow now blurring on the horizon. Her muscles screamed, a chorus of protest against the brutal cold and the raw insistence of survival. Every movement was a deliberate act of defiance, a refusal to surrender to the numbing embrace of the ice. She dragged her crippled leg, a dead weight against the drifts, her breath a ragged banner in the frigid air. The pain, a familiar companion, had dulled to a persistent ache, a low thrumming beneath the surface of her awareness, leaving her mind free to wander the bleak corridors of her past, revisiting every wrong, every prejudice. "Why me?" she rasped, the question a hoarse whisper swallowed by the wind. Not a plea, but a bitter challenge to the indifferent sky. Her life had been one long fight, a continuous proving of her strength, her skill, her right to exist in a world that sought to diminish her. The limp, the perpetual companion of her days since the accident, had only sharpened her resolve, honed her senses, made her more acutely aware of the world's subtle cruelties. She had mastered the horse, the rope, the rifle, not despite her injury, but often because of it, finding new ways to adapt, to overcome. Yet, in the eyes of Silas and the others, she was merely a broken tool, discarded, left to rust. It was a familiar narrative, played out in countless lives across these lands, where weakness was a death sentence and difference a crime. Just as the last vestiges of hope began to crumble, giving way to the seductive pull of exhaustion, a shape emerged from the swirling snow, a dark, indistinct form against the white expanse. It was a rider, silhouetted against the dying light, an anomaly in this barren wasteland. Her first instinct was wariness, a gut-deep distrust forged in the crucible of betrayal. Was this a mirage? A trick of her fading mind? Or worse, another harbinger of cruelty, another face ready to judge and condemn? The horse was magnificent, a powerful silhouette against the bruised sky, and the rider sat tall, emanating an aura of quiet authority, yet also a strange, unreadable stillness. He was an unknown quantity, a riddle in the vast, empty canvas of her impending doom. The tension thickened, a palpable current in the frigid air, as the horse steadily closed the distance, its hooves crunching softly on the frozen ground. He was here, an unexpected intrusion into her carefully constructed wall of defiance, and for the first time in days, a tiny, fragile tendril of something akin to fear, or perhaps even a forbidden flicker of hope, began to stir in the desolate chambers of her heart. The rider dismounted, with an economy of motion, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the frozen landscape, the desperate situation, and her huddled form, without a hint of surprise or alarm. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, held a deep, unreadable intelligence, framed by lines etched by sun and hardship. He didn't offer effusive words of comfort, didn't fuss or pander to her perceived fragility. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed, devoid of pity, yet not unkind. "You're a long way from anywhere, cowgirl, and judging by the look of you, you've been here a while." It wasn't a question, but an observation, blunt and to the point. He moved with a practiced ease, his movements deliberate, his hands reaching for the supplies on his saddle. He didn't ask her name, didn't demand an explanation, simply assessed the immediate need. He unwrapped a thick blanket, its wool smelling of campfire smoke and horses, and without fanfare, draped it over her shivering shoulders. The warmth was a shock, a sudden, unfamiliar sensation that caused a wave of dizziness to wash over her. She watched him, her gaze narrow, wary, like a cornered wolf. She had learned long ago that kindness often came with a price, and that the world's generosity was rarely without an agenda. His actions were practical, not sentimental, yet their impact was profound. He offered her a canteen, the water within miraculously unfrozen, and a piece of dried meat, its savory scent a cruel torture to her starved senses. "Eat," he instructed, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. Her throat was raw, but she managed to swallow, the meager sustenance a desperate battle against her body's protests. She expected questions, an interrogation, a demand for her story, but he simply watched her, his gaze steady, unblinking. It was a silence that held its own tension, a unspoken challenge to her deep-seated suspicion. Who was this man, emerging from the desolate white, offering help without judgment? A stark contrast to the faces that had abandoned her. He seemed to see past her limp, past the frostbite, to the raw, untamed spirit still flickering beneath the layers of despair. He was a puzzle, an anomaly, a stark, unsettling mirror to the world's indifference, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something beyond bitterness, a tentative spark of curiosity about the man who had simply appeared, a harbinger of the unknown, amidst her quiet, desolate end. He didn't speak much as he helped her onto his horse, the saddle a sudden luxury against her battered body. His touch was firm, professional, yet she sensed a strange reserve beneath his stoic demeanor. He wasn't overtly gentle, but neither was he rough. He simply moved her, a silent force, accepting her weakness without comment, which in itself was a profound relief after the scorn she had endured. They rode through the deepening twilight, the world fading to shades of blue and gray, the wind still biting, but now less menacing, softened by the blanket's warmth and the cowboy's silent presence. He seemed to know these frozen wastes, navigating the treacherous terrain with an intuitive grace, a stark contrast to her own, once effortless, mastery. She watched his profile, rugged and unyielding, etched against the gathering gloom. Who was this man? She knew nothing of him, only that he possessed the means and the inclination to be out here, in this desolate wilderness, alone. There was a sense of something hidden about him, a quiet tension in his broad shoulders, a shadow in his unreadable eyes that hinted at his own untold story, his own reasons for traversing such empty spaces. Perhaps he too was running from something, or seeking a quiet solitude that only the wild could offer. His wealth, subtly evident in the quality of his gear, his sturdy horse, only added to the mystery. Was he merely a Samaritan, or was there another motive lurking beneath the surface of his benevolence? The harsh landscape, its jagged peaks mirroring the sharp edges of her own past, seemed to stretch endlessly around them, a vast, indifferent canvas for their shared, silent journey. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves on snow, the occasional snort of the horse, and the relentless sigh of the wind. It was a silence that allowed for reflection, for the slow, cautious assessment of an unexpected alliance. He offered no reassurances, no false platitudes, simply continued to ride, a silent sentinel against the encroaching night. And in that shared silence, amidst the stark beauty of the freezing wilderness, a tenuous, unspoken bond began to form, not of words, but of shared vulnerability, a silent agreement to endure the unknown together. The tension wasn't hostile, but anticipatory, a quiet understanding that their fates were now inextricably linked, even if they knew nothing of each other's inner demons. The years before had been a tapestry woven with grit and defiance. Martha, even then, carried a stubborn refusal to be defined by anything other than her own strength. She had been born into a world that expected women to be docile, to remain within the confines of the home, but her spirit yearned for the open range, the untamed freedom of the wind. Her father, a grizzled rancher with a soft spot for his spirited daughter, had taught her to ride before she could properly walk, to shoot with an accuracy that shamed most men, and to mend fences with a skill that rivaled the best. She had been more than capable. She had been exceptional, a true cowgirl forged in the crucible of hard labor and endless skies. Her reputation preceded her, a whisper of a woman who could outride, outwork, and outthink any man on the trail. Then came the accident. A rogue steer, a moment of misplaced trust in a young horse, and the world had tilted. The fall had been brutal, a sickening crack of bone and tearing of flesh, leaving her with a shattered knee, a perpetual limp, and the bitter knowledge that her body, once a seamless extension of her will, now defied her. The men who had once admired her prowess now looked at her with pity, their glances tinged with an uncomfortable awkwardness. The whispers changed, morphing from awe to sympathetic murmurs about the poor girl, the one with the bad leg. Society, ever ready to categorize and diminish, had labeled her, reduced her to her injury. But Martha refused to be defined by a broken bone. She had learned to adapt, to ride with a brace, to compensate with her arms and core, developing a strength that was both physical and emotional, a deeper well of resilience. She found new ways to contribute, honing her knowledge of cattle, learning to spot trouble on the range with an almost preternatural intuition. She had survived, even thrived, in her own way, proving to herself, if not to others, that her worth was not measured by the perfection of her gait. Yet the old wound, the deep, abiding prejudice against weakness, lingered like a phantom ache. She was a woman in a man's world, and a disabled woman at that. The abandonment by Silas and the others was not just a personal betrayal, but a raw embodiment of that societal judgment, a blunt declaration that her indomitable spirit, her hard-won skills, were simply not enough in the face of their narrow-minded perception of what constituted a whole human being. The memory of their faces, cold and unwavering, fueled a bitter fire in her gut, a grim reminder of the perpetual fight she had waged, and continued to wage, against a world determined to break her. The storm descended with a sudden, savage fury, a maelstrom of swirling snow and biting wind that turned the vast plains into a blinding white hell. It was an unthinking, primal force, stripping away the thin veneer of human control, leaving only raw instinct. The horse whinnied, its breath steaming, struggling against the deepening drifts, and Martha, nestled precariously in front of the cowboy, felt the cold seep into her bones, threatening to reclaim the ground she had gained. This wasn't just a challenge. It was a desperate test of their nascent trust, a crucible in which their fragile bond would either shatter or solidify. The cowboy, his face a mask of grim determination, wrestled with the reins, his focus absolute. He didn't utter a single complaint, didn't falter, simply leaned into the gale, a silent anchor in the chaos. Her own strength, though diminished, surged with a renewed ferocity. She tightened her grip on his waist, a wordless promise of solidarity, her eyes scanning the swirling white for any sign of a break, any hint of shelter. The world outside them disappeared, shrinking to the desperate, rhythmic struggle of horse and riders against the elements. This was a shared vulnerability, a stark revelation of their individual limitations in the face of nature's brutal might. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at their clothes, and the snow stung their faces like 1,000 tiny needles. In the heart of the storm, stripped bare of all pretense, the unspoken became palpable. He grunted, a short, sharp sound, indicating a narrow crevice in a rock face, a desperate hope for reprieve. With immense effort, they maneuvered the horse into the meager shelter, the sudden, relative quiet a deafening contrast to the roar of the tempest. Huddled together, sharing the limited warmth of the blanket and the horse's body heat, the barriers between them began to truly crumble. He offered her a flask of whiskey, a potent fire that spread through her chilled veins, warming her from the inside out. He didn't offer sympathy, but a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal reality they faced. "We ride it out," he rasped, his voice rough, yet strangely comforting in its simplicity. It was in this shared desperate struggle, in the raw intimacy of survival, that she saw past the rich cowboy facade, past the unreadable eyes, to the man beneath. He was not just a rescuer. He was a fellow survivor, flawed and complex, yet capable of an unwavering strength when it truly mattered. The storm outside raged, but within the small, dark shelter, a different kind of quiet understanding began to solidify, forged in the crucible of fear and shared hardship. This was the moment where their shared humanity eclipsed their differences, where the individual struggles merged into a singular, desperate fight for another dawn. The morning after the storm broke, a bleak, bruised light revealed the desolate landscape. It was then, as they began to ride again, that they spotted them, a cluster of figures in the distance, silhouetted against the stark white, moving slowly. Silas and his crew. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread and bitter fury. The pivotal emotional climax was upon them, unbidden and inevitable. Her gaze darted to the cowboy, his expression unreadable, but his hand had subtly tightened on the reins, his posture becoming rigid. He knew. "They left me," she rasped, the words torn from her, raw with years of suppressed anger and humiliation. "Left me to freeze." The cowboy didn't reply, but his jaw clenched, a muscle working beneath his weathered skin. As they drew closer, the figures came into sharper focus, their faces hardened by the cold and perhaps by the memory of their own cowardice. Silas was at the forefront, his flint eyes widening as he recognized her, a ghost returned from the grave. A collective gasp went through his men, a mixture of shock and superstitious dread. "Martha?" Silas's voice was a croak, laced with disbelief, a flicker of guilt, quickly masked by a return to his usual bluster. "What in hell?" "We thought you were gone." His gaze shifted to the cowboy, curiosity warring with suspicion. "Who's this? You got a guardian angel now?" The cowboy reined in his horse, a powerful beast that seemed to dwarf their own weary mounts. His voice, when he spoke, was low, calm, yet held a dangerous edge that cut through the crisp air. "She's with me, and she was left to die." "Care to explain that, friend?" The tension stretched, thin and brittle as ice. Silas shifted, uncomfortable, his men exchanging nervous glances. "She was a liability, stranger. Couldn't keep up." "The leg." The cowboy cut him off, his voice suddenly sharp, a whip crack in the stillness. "A liability? Or a woman who showed you up, time and again, despite your own shortcomings? You left a human being to perish in the cold. That ain't just a liability, Silas. That's a crime against decency." His words were blunt, uncompromising, stripping away their flimsy excuses, exposing their moral rot. Martha watched, a silent observer of the confrontation, a mixture of vindication and raw pain swirling within her. This wasn't just a battle for her life. It was a battle for her dignity, for the acknowledgement of her worth that had been denied her for so long. The cowboy's defense wasn't about him. It was about her, a powerful, unspoken affirmation of her humanity. The wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable outcome. The open loop of her abandonment was finally closing, but not without a searing, painful confrontation that laid bare the truth of human cowardice and the surprising strength found in unexpected allies. The standoff hung heavy in the frigid air, a fragile moment poised on the edge of violence. Silas, cornered and exposed, bristled, his hand inching towards the pistol on his hip. His men shuffled nervously, their eyes darting between their foreman and the imposing figure of the rich cowboy, who sat astride his magnificent horse, unyielding, his gaze like iron. "This ain't your business, stranger," Silas growled, his voice regaining some of its former bluster, though tinged with desperation. "This is a ranch matter. A woman's place ain't on the range with a busted leg." His words were a last, pathetic grasp at the patriarchal biases that had always dictated his narrow world, a final attempt to justify his cruel abandonment. But the cowboy simply tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "Her place," he stated, his voice a low thrum that resonated with quiet authority, "is wherever she chooses to be. And your place, Silas, is a long way from ever making that decision for anyone, let alone for a woman who has more grit in her little finger than you have in your entire miserable crew." The insult was a deliberate, precise strike, aimed directly at the core of Silas's fragile masculinity. The other men winced, their allegiance wavering in the face of such uncompromising defiance. Martha, still on the cowboy's horse, felt a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She leaned forward, her voice, though raspy, cutting through the tense silence. "He speaks the truth, Silas. You saw a weakness, but it was yours, not mine. You cast me out because you were afraid of what I represented. A woman who wouldn't break, who wouldn't conform. And that," she concluded, her gaze unwavering, "scared you more than any blizzard." Her words were a final, brutal blow, stripping Silas of his last shred of authority, laying bare the deep-seated prejudice that had driven his actions. The air crackled with a silent, profound shift. The tables had turned. Silas, defeated, sagged slightly, his eyes falling, unable to meet her gaze or the cowboy's unwavering stare. The cowboy didn't press the advantage with violence. His victory was in the quiet, undeniable truth he had forced into the open. The confrontation wasn't about a fight, but about justice, about the undeniable weight of a moral stand. The open loops of her past, the nagging questions of why and how she was left, had been brutally answered, not by her, but by the undeniable mirror held up to her tormentors. The tension, once so suffocating, began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, resolute victory, not of fists, but of spirit. The bitter wind still whispered, but now it carried the echo of her triumph, not the lament of her despair. The silence that settled after Silas and his cowed crew rode off was not empty, but thick with the resonant hum of aftermath. The air, crisp and cold, felt cleansed, as if the bitter truth had swept away the lingering shadows of betrayal. Martha remained on the cowboy's horse, her body still aching, but her spirit, once so deeply wounded, now pulsed with a quiet, fierce triumph. The confrontation had been raw, exposing the ugliest parts of humanity, but it had also, unexpectedly, revealed the unexpected capacity for righteousness in another. She looked at the cowboy, truly looked at him, no longer with suspicion, but with a profound, unspoken gratitude. He hadn't asked for her story, hadn't demanded her allegiance, yet he had stood by her, a silent, unwavering pillar against the tide of injustice. His face, still stoic, held a subtle softness she hadn't noticed before. A hint of something deeper than the harsh exterior suggested. The weight of her past, the constant need to prove herself, the gnawing bitterness of abandonment, felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. The landscape, once a stark reminder of her solitude, now seemed to breathe with a quiet promise. The low sun cast long, shimmering shadows across the snow, painting the world in hues of gold and amber, a stark contrast to the oppressive gray of her despair. This was a moment of reflection, a quiet processing of the tectonic shift that had occurred within her. She was no longer just the disabled cowgirl left to freeze. She was the woman who had faced her tormentors, supported by an unlikely ally, and emerged whole. The open loops of resentment and unanswered questions had been finally tied, not with revenge, but with truth. There was no grand declaration, no outpouring of emotion, just a shared, unspoken understanding that transcended words. The dark, emotional tone of her journey was beginning to yield to the first fragile shoots of hope, a hope born not of naive optimism, but of hard-won experience and the quiet certainty that even in the most desolate of places, compassion could find a way to bloom. The wind, which had once mocked her, now carried a faint, almost imperceptible hum of possibility, a whisper of a future unburdened by the weight of her bitter past. The journey continued, but now a subtle shift had occurred. The miles they covered were no longer just a desperate escape, but a purposeful progression towards an uncertain, yet hopeful, horizon. The cowboy, whose name she learned was Elias, remained a man of few words, but his silence was no longer a wall, but a comfortable space for shared contemplation. He led them to a small, secluded cabin nestled deep within a forgotten valley, a place he called his own, a sanctuary tucked away from the judging eyes of the world. It was rustic, humble, yet held an air of quiet self-sufficiency, mirroring his own grounded nature. Here, away from the harsh scrutiny of society, Martha found a space to heal, not just her body, but her spirit. Elias tended to her frostbite with a practiced gentleness, his large hands surprisingly deft. He didn't hover, didn't fuss, simply provided the quiet care that allowed her to regain her strength. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, sharing simple meals, the crackle of the fireplace, a constant companion. She noticed the subtle flaws in him, the deep-set lines around his eyes that spoke of his own battles, his own losses. He was not a savior, but a fellow traveler on a solitary path, a man who had chosen to walk away from a world that perhaps had also judged him, albeit for different reasons. His wealth, she realized, was not about opulence, but about freedom, about the ability to choose his own life, unburdened by societal expectations. The irony was palpable. She, the discarded cowgirl, found refuge with a man of means, who had chosen to live a life stripped bare of superficiality. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of survival and sealed by shared defiance, transcended mere friendship. It was a deep, quiet connection, built on respect and understanding, a bond rooted in shared hardship and a profound appreciation for each other's resilience. The dark emotional tone began to lift completely, replaced by a sense of calm, a hopeful resolution that was not born of fairy tale endings, but of the quiet dignity of two souls finding solace in each other's quiet strength. The cabin, with its warm glow against the vast wilderness, became a symbol of a new beginning, a place where their individual struggles converged into a shared path, promising a future, however uncertain, filled with the quiet comfort of acceptance and mutual respect. The symbolism was clear. From the icy grip of abandonment Warmth had finally found its way in, not just physical, but emotional. A quiet triumph against a world that had once sought to extinguish her very flame. The days stretched into weeks, then months, marked not by the calendar, but by the quiet unfolding of their lives in the secluded valley. Martha's limp remained, a constant reminder of her past, but it no longer defined her. With Elias's patient help and her own fierce determination, she learned to compensate, to adapt, finding new ways to move with grace and purpose, to tend to the small herd of horses Elias kept, to mend leather, to live fully despite her physical limitations. Her skills, once dismissed, were now valued, not just by Elias, but by herself. She was whole, not despite her disability, but with it, a testament to her unbreakable spirit. Elias, in turn, softened, his stoic demeanor cracking to reveal a deeper well of quiet affection and a wry sense of humor. He spoke more, sharing glimpses of his own journey, a past shadowed by the burdens of wealth and the expectations of a society he had ultimately rejected. He too had been, in his own way, left to freeze by a world that sought to control and define him. They found common ground in their shared rejection of societal norms, in their mutual understanding of the quiet strength found in self-reliance and the raw beauty of the untamed land. Their bond was not one of romantic fervor, but of a profound, enduring partnership. Two solitary souls who had found an unexpected haven in each other. They were two halves of a whole, each complementing the other's strengths and vulnerabilities. The valley, once a desperate refuge, had become their home, a sanctuary where they could truly be themselves, unburdened by the prejudice and judgment of the outside world. The narrative reached its quiet, hopeful resolution, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the steady beat of life lived authentically, with dignity and acceptance. Martha, the disabled cowgirl, was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had found. Not just survival, but true self-worth, a loyal companion, and a quiet, enduring peace. The rich cowboy, once a solitary enigma, had found his own form of redemption in helping another, in seeing beyond the superficial to the unbreakable spirit within. Their story was a powerful testament to the enduring human spirit, a quiet triumph echoing across the vast, indifferent landscape, proving that even after being left to freeze, a heart, once broken, can still find warmth, still find purpose, and still find a way to bloom.